The courtroom echoed with the sharp, cruel laughter of a woman draped in diamonds, mocking the sobbing, heavily pregnant widow sitting just feet away. She thought she had won. She thought she had taken the husband, the mansion, and the multi-million-dollar real estate empire, leaving the rightful wife with absolutely nothing but a shattered life. But in a court of law, arrogant greed is a very dangerous game. When the judge finally slammed the gavel and unsealed the final hidden addendum of the late billionaire's trust, the Mistress Bureau vanished, replaced by sheer breathless terror. This is the jaw-dropping true story of ultimate betrayal, devastating public humiliation, and the most satisfying courtroom revenge you will ever hear. The air inside Cook County Probate Courtroom 204 was stifling, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, old polished oak, and the palpable electricity of impending ruin. It was a miserable Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of gray, relentless Chicago day that seemed to mirror the bleakness of the proceedings about to unfold. Sitting at the petitioner's table was Clara Sterling. At 32 years old, she was 7 months pregnant, her petite frame swallowed by a simple, conservative black maternity dress that hung off her diminishing shoulders. Her face was ashen, drained of color by 3 agonizing weeks of grief, sleeplessness, and unrelenting stress. Beneath her eyes, deep violet shadows told the story of a woman who had been pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. Her hands, trembling faintly, were clasped defensively over her swollen abdomen, instinctively shielding her unborn child from the venomous atmosphere of the room. Clara was the legal wife of Richard Sterling, a 58-year-old titan of commercial real estate who had perished exactly 22 days prior when his private helicopter went down in a sudden violent squall over Lake Michigan. For 5 years, Clara had been the dutiful, supportive wife, standing by Richard as he aggressively expanded Sterling Global Properties into a billion-dollar syndicate. They had struggled for years to conceive, enduring round after agonizing round of IVF treatments. When Clara finally fell pregnant, she thought her life was complete. But Richard had changed. As his wealth skyrocketed, so did his ego, and the loving husband she had married was quickly replaced by a cold, distant stranger who spent more nights at his downtown penthouse than at their sprawling Gold Coast estate. And then there was Vanessa. The heavy, brass-studded double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a dramatic thud, immediately drawing the eyes of the packed gallery. In walked Vanessa Kensington, accompanied by a sharp click-clack of Christian Louboutin heels that echoed like gunshots against the marble floor. She was 26, flawlessly beautiful, and exuded an aura of venomous confidence, defying every unspoken rule of courtroom decorum and mourning. Vanessa wore a tailored, vibrant scarlet suit that hugged her curves, her neck adorned with a blinding cascade of flawless diamonds that Clara recognized instantly. They were from the Sterling family vault, pieces that had belonged to Richard's mother. Vanessa was Richard's executive assistant. In reality, she was his blatant, unapologetic mistress, a woman who had spent the last 18 months systematically invading Clara's life, parading her affair in front of Richard's high society friends while Clara was bedridden with a difficult first trimester. Flanked by a team of 3 expensive corporate litigators, Vanessa strutted down the central aisle, her chin tilted upward in a picture of supreme arrogance. The gallery, packed to maximum capacity with Sterling Global board members, hungry journalists, and whispering socialites, parted for her like the Red Sea. She didn't just walk. She paraded, fully aware that she was the center of the tension. When Vanessa reached the front row of the gallery, directly behind the petitioner's table where Clara sat, she leaned forward. The heavy, intoxicating scent of Baccarat Rouge 540 washed over Clara, making her stomach churn. "You should have saved your money on the lawyer, Clara," Vanessa whispered, her voice a sickly sweet purr loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You're getting nothing, sweetie. You and your little bastard are going to be out on the street by Friday. Nout. Axcom. Now. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. She bit her lower lip so hard she tasted copper, refusing to give Vanessa the satisfaction of a verbal response. Beside her, Thomas Abernathy, an older, seasoned probate attorney with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, placed a steady, reassuring hand on Clara's arm. "Don't look at her, Clara," Thomas murmured gently, his voice low and raspy. "Let her have her moment of theatre. The louder they are, the harder they fall." But Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fear was paralyzing. Following Richard's sudden death, Vanessa had forcibly seized control of Richard's downtown office and locked Clara out of all the joint bank accounts, producing a document she claimed was Richard's final testament. Since then, Clara had been living on borrowed money from her aging parents, terrified that the mansion she called home would be ripped away from her before her baby was even born. The side door adjacent to the bench suddenly opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed over the hushed murmurs of the room. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Patricia Caldwell presiding." Judge Caldwell, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, swept into the room, her black robes billowing. She took her seat at the elevated bench, adjusting her microphone with a sharp, metallic screech that silenced the remaining whispers in the gallery. She peered over her reading glasses, surveying the tense division in the room, the grieving, pregnant widow on one side, and the triumphant, scarlet-clad mistress on the other. "Be seated," Judge Caldwell commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a scythe. She opened the thick manila file resting on the mahogany wood before her. "We are here today regarding the matter of the estate of Richard Harrison Sterling. Counsel, I understand there is a dispute regarding the validity of the last will and testament." There was speaking for the petitioner. Gregory Fields, Vanessa's lead attorney, shot up from his chair. He was a slick, aggressive bulldog of a lawyer, known for bullying his way through probate courts. "Your Honor," Gregory announced, his voice booming with unearned authority, "I represent Miss Vanessa Kensington, the sole named beneficiary and executor of the late Mr. Sterling's estate, as dictated by his final legally binding will, executed just 2 months prior to his tragic passing." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The nightmare was officially beginning. She gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, bracing herself for the humiliation she knew was coming. The gathering storm had finally broken, and the first lightning strike was aimed squarely at her heart. Gregory Fields stepped out from behind his table, buttoning his expensive Italian suit jacket as he approached the center of the courtroom. He carried a crisp blue-backed legal document, holding it up like a trophy for the judge in the gallery to see. "Your Honor," Gregory began, his tone dripping with practiced melancholy that didn't reach his eyes. The sudden loss of Richard Sterling was a tragedy that shook the financial world, but Richard, ever the meticulous businessman, foresaw the need to get his affairs in order. The document I have submitted to this court is a fully executed, notarized, last will and testament dated August 14th of this year. It unequivocally supersedes any prior wills, trusts, or verbal promises. Judge Caldwell flipped through her copy of the document, her expression unreadable. "Proceed, Mr. Fields." "To put it plainly, Your Honor," Gregory said, turning slightly so he was half facing Clara, "the marriage between Richard Sterling and Clara Sterling was effectively over. They were living entirely separate lives. Richard had found his true life partner in my client, Miss Kensington. As such, his final will reflects his true desires." Gregory cleared his throat, opening the document to read verbatim. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. "I, Richard Harrison Sterling," Gregory read, his voice ringing out, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. I leave the entirety of my shares in Sterling Global Properties, my primary residence located in the Gold Coast, the penthouse at Trump Tower, all offshore and domestic liquid assets, and all personal property to my beloved partner, Vanessa Kensington. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The sheer brutality of a complete disinheritance was rare, especially involving a lawful spouse. But Gregory wasn't finished. He looked directly at Clara, a cruel glint in his eye. "To my estranged wife, Clara Sterling," he continued, raising his voice to ensure every syllable landed like a physical blow, "I leave the sum of $50,000 to be dispersed strictly for moving expenses. I specifically and explicitly exclude her from any further claim to my estate. Furthermore—" Gregory paused, letting the tension stretch until it was agonizing. He glanced at Vanessa, who was practically vibrating with glee. "Sir, furthermore, due to the complete breakdown of our marital relations over the past year, I formally state my profound doubt regarding the paternity of the child Clara Sterling currently carries. I forbid any of my estate's resources to be utilized for the rearing of a child I do not believe to be my own." The courtroom exploded. Shouts of shock erupted from the gallery. Flashbolts from the rogue photographer went off near the doors before a bailiff tackled him. The public humiliation was total, devastating, and absolute. Clara felt the blood drain entirely from her head. The room spun wildly. She clutched her stomach, bending forward as a physical wave of nausea and unbearable shame washed over her. Richard was cruel at the end, yes, but to accuse her of infidelity on public record? To disown his own heavily anticipated medically assisted trial? It was a level of monstrous vindictiveness she couldn't comprehend. Behind her, Vanessa let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. It was a piercing, triumphant sound that cut through the chaos of the courtroom. "Told you," Vanessa sneered audibly, leaning over the wooden barrier. "You're a joke, Clara, a pathetic, cheating joke. Order, order in this court." Judge Caldwell roared, slamming her wooden gavel down repeatedly. "Bailiff, remove anyone who speaks out of turn. One more outburst, and I will clear this gallery." "Oxo. Sanad man. Ori. The room slowly quieted, though the heavy, oppressive weight of the scandal lingered in the air. Clara was openly weeping now, silent, shaking sobs racking her pregnant frame. She felt dirty, exposed, stripped of her dignity in front of the city's elite. Gregory Fields offered a smug, apologetic bow to the judge. "I apologize for the emotional nature of the document, Your Honor, but the law is clear. A testator has the absolute right to dispose of his property as he sees fit. Given the explicitly hostile nature of the marriage and the paternity doubts, we are formally requesting that Clara Sterling be ordered to vacate the Gold Coast estate by 5:00 p.m. this Friday. Miss Kensington is the legal owner of the property and wishes to take immediate possession. Not, it's sold to, Vanessa adjusted her diamond necklace. A smirk plastered so deeply on her perfectly contoured face that it looked permanent. She had won. She had taken everything, the wealth, the status, the homes, and now the total destruction of Clara's reputation. Judge Caldwell looked down at Clara, a flicker of genuine pity crossing her stern features. She turned her attention to Clara's lawyer. "Mr. Abernathy," the judge said softly, "does the defense have a response to this rather highly irregular document? Do you intend to contest the validity of the August 14th will based on undue influence?" For a long, agonizing moment, Thomas Abernathy didn't move. He sat there, his hands neatly folded over a worn leather briefcase. He let the silence hang, letting Vanessa's smirk solidify, letting Gregory Fields bask in his apparent victory. Then, slowly, deliberately, Thomas stood up. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defeated. In fact, he looked incredibly, dangerously calm. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed, thick manila envelope, bound with a red wax seal. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice smooth, carrying effortlessly across the room, "we do not intend to argue undue influence regarding the August 14th will." Gregory Fields chuckled under his breath, leaning back in his chair. Vanessa beamed, already calculating which of Clara's designer furniture pieces she would throw into the street first. "We will not argue undue influence," Thomas continued, stepping out from behind the table, his eyes locking onto Vanessa with cold, clinical precision, "because fighting over a forged, fraudulent piece of fiction is a waste of this court's valuable time." The smaggering end Vanessa's face faltered just a fraction of an inch. "If opposing counsel is quite finished parading this theatrical garbage," Thomas said, raising the sealed envelope into the air, "the estate of Richard Harrison Sterling has actual, legally binding business to attend to. Business that I assure you will change the current atmosphere of this room considerably." The silence in Probate Courtroom 204 was so profound that the faint rhythmic ticking of the antique mahogany clock on the back wall sounded like a sledgehammer. Thomas Abernathy stood tall, the red wax seal of the heavy manila envelope catching the harsh fluorescent lights. He didn't rush. He allowed the weight of his statement to settle over the gallery, over the judge, and most importantly, over the smirking mistress in the scarlet suit. "Fraudulent," Gregory Fields sputtered, his slick composure fracturing for the first time. He gripped the edges of his podium, leaning forward aggressively. "Your Honor, I object to this blatant grandstanding. The will I have submitted was notarized by a licensed professional. If Mr. Abernathy has no intention of contesting it, he needs to concede and allow my client to take possession of her rightful property." Judge Patricia Caldwell ignored Gregory entirely. Her sharp blue eyes were locked on Thomas. "Approach the bench, Mr. Abernathy. And you as well, Mr. Fields. Let us see what is in this envelope." Thomas stepped forward, handing a thick, expertly bound document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. He then handed a duplicate copy to a suddenly pale Gregory Fields. "What you are holding, Your Honor, is the formal charter and execution documents for the Sterling Family Dynasty Trust," Thomas explained, his voice projecting clearly to ensure the reporters in the back row caught every syllable. "It was drafted 4 years ago by the senior estate partners at Sidley Austin LLP, one of the most prestigious law firms in Chicago, and fully funded 3.5 years ago." Vanessa Kensington's heavily contoured brow furrowed. She turned at the sleeve of her co-counsel, a junior lawyer who was currently staring at the document with widening eyes. "What is he talking about?" Vanessa hissed loudly. "What trust? Richard told me everything was in his name." "A dynasty trust, Your Honor," Thomas continued, turning slightly so he could look Vanessa dead in the eye, "is a highly specific legal instrument designed to pass wealth from generation to generation without incurring estate taxes. But its most vital characteristic is that it is strictly and entirely irrevocable." Clara sat frozen at the petitioner's table, her hand still resting on her pregnant belly. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird. She remembered Richard meeting with attorneys from Sidley Austin years ago, back when they were happy, back when they first started trying for a baby. He had told her it was just standard corporate housekeeping. She had no idea what it truly meant. Judge Caldwell flipped through the heavy parchment pages, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with practiced speed. "I am looking at the schedule of assets transferred into this trust upon its execution," she said, her voice dropping an octave in sheer astonishment. "Mr. Abernathy, am I reading this correctly?" "You are, Your Honor," Thomas replied, a rare shark-like smile touching the corners of his mouth. 3.5 years ago, Richard Sterling transferred 98% of his total earthly assets into this trust. That includes his controlling shares of Sterling Global Properties, the deed to the Gold Coast estate, the offshore accounts held at Credit Suisse, and his extensive stock portfolio managed by J.P. Morgan Private Bank. "Objection!" Gregory shouted, his face turning a mottled shade of crimson. "This is a fabrication. Richard Sterling operated those companies until the day he died." He paid the property taxes on that estate just last month. He operated them as a designated fiduciary manager, Mr. Burr. Fields, not as the owner, Thomas shot back, his voice cracking like a whip. The actual owner of those assets is the Northern Trust Company, acting as the corporate trustee. Richard relinquished his personal ownership over 3 years ago. He legally could not give those assets away in a will because they did not belong to him. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of murmurs. The board members in the gallery leaned forward furiously, whispering to one another. The real estate empire wasn't in limbo. It was locked in a vault that Vanessa Kensington had no key to. Quiet, Judge Caldwell barked, slamming her gavel. Once the room settled, she looked down at Gregory Fields. Mr. Fields, basic property law states that a testator cannot bequeath what he does not own. If these assets are locked inside a valid, irrevocable trust predating your client's will by several years, the August 14th will is effectively attempting to give away a kingdom that Mr. Sterling already surrendered. We will challenge the trust, Gregory declared desperately, sweat beading on his forehead. If Richard was placed under undue influence to create it, he created it while he was happily married, in perfect health, and advised by a team of 10 different lawyers. Thomas interrupted smoothly. Good luck piercing a Sidley Austin trust in Illinois. It would take you a decade and millions of dollars you do not have. Vanessa stood up, her chair screeching violently against the marble floor. The arrogant, triumphant aura she had paraded into the room was evaporating, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. The diamonds around her neck suddenly looked less like a crown and more like a collar. "Gregory, do something!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing. "He left it to me. He promised me the company. He promised me the house. You read the will." "Miss Kensington, sit down and remain silent, or I will have you held in contempt and placed in a holding cell," Judge Caldwell ordered, her tone colder than absolute zero. Vanessa sank back into her chair, her perfectly manicured nails biting into the mahogany table. She glared at Clara, her eyes burning with a hateful, desperate fire. Clara didn't look away this time. The crushing weight that had been suffocating her for 3 weeks was beginning to lift, replaced by a sudden fierce rush of maternal protection. "So, Mr. Abernathy," Judge Caldwell said, leaning back in her heavy leather chair, "if the trust owns the lion's share of the wealth, who are the named beneficiaries?" "Now, Tot Blubin Totgully." Thomas walked back to his table and stood beside Clara, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "The trust was established for the explicit benefit of Richard's legitimate lawful heirs. Clara Sterling is named as the primary lifetime income beneficiary and the sole trustee over the physical properties. She cannot be evicted, Your Honor, because the trust guarantees her lifetime tenancy in the Gold Coast estate." Clara let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She wasn't going to be homeless. She wasn't going to have to beg her parents to take her in. The house, the nursery she had painstakingly painted by hand, was still hers. "And the principal of the trust?" the judge asked. "The company shares?" "Not that. Soricum. They are held in generation-skipping stasis," Thomas proclaimed proudly. "They will vest entirely to the firstborn child of Richard and Clara Sterling upon that child's 25th birthday." Vanessa let out a dark, bitter laugh, pointing a trembling, scarlet-tipped finger at Clara's stomach. "Except he knew," Vanessa yelled, completely disregarding the judge's previous warning. "He knew that baby wasn't his. It's in the will, Judge. He specifically stated he doubted the paternity. That bastard child gets nothing." Thomas Abernathy slowly turned his head to look at Vanessa. He didn't look angry. He looked like a chess grandmaster who had just cornered his opponent's king. "I'm so glad you brought that up, Miss Kensington," Thomas said quietly, "because that brings us to the final and most crucial piece of business." The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt as though the very air might snap. Gregory Fields aggressively grabbed Vanessa's arm, yanking her back down into her seat, whispering furiously into her ear. But Vanessa was shaking, her eyes darting between her lawyer, the judge, and the thick legal document that had just derailed her entire life. Thomas Abernathy reached into his worn leather briefcase one final time. He withdrew a sleek white folder bearing the distinct blue logo of LabCorp, one of the nation's premier clinical and genetic testing laboratories. "Your Honor," Thomas addressed the bench, his tone shifting from theatrical to strictly clinical. "Miss Kensington is correct about one thing. Richard Sterling, perhaps manipulated by outside forces in his final months, or perhaps in a state of paranoia, did attempt to insert a paternity clause into his affairs. However, because the assets were already locked within the dynasty trust, he could not simply write Clara or the child out. The trust charter required definitive medical proof to disinherit a legal heir." Gregory Fields stood up, trying to salvage whatever wreckage he could. "And my client submitted will explicitly states his profound doubts. The petitioner cannot prove that child belongs to Mr. Moms Sterling, especially now that he is deceased." "Actually, Mr. Fields, we already have," Thomas countered, sliding the white folder across the judge bench. Clara watched, utterly spellbound. Thomas had visited her home a week ago, bringing along a certified phlebotomist. He had told her it was a necessary medical precaution for the legal fight ahead, but she hadn't understood the full scope of his strategy until this exact second. "What I have just submitted to the court are the results of a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, or NIP," Thomas explained to the gallery. "It is a highly advanced, court-admissible genetic test that analyzes cell-free fetal DNA found in the mother's bloodstream. We compared the fetal DNA extracted from Mrs. Sterling against a verified medical-grade DNA profile of Richard Sterling, which was securely kept on file at Northwestern Memorial Hospital following a prostate biopsy he underwent 2 years ago." The courtroom held its collective breath. Vanessa stopped struggling against her lawyer's grip. "The results, certified by 2 independent geneticists, confirm a 99.908% probability of paternity," Thomas declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Richard Sterling is the biological father of the child Clara Sterling is currently carrying. The baby is the sole indisputable heir to the billion-dollar Sterling Dynasty Trust. Miss Kensington's vicious, baseless slander regarding my client's fidelity is thoroughly scientifically dismantled." Clara let out a sob, not of grief, but of pure, overwhelming relief. She pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling a sudden, strong kick against her palm. Her baby was safe. Her honor was restored. The horrible, dirty lies Vanessa had spread through the country clubs and boardrooms of Chicago were dead and buried. "This is an outrage," Gregory bellowed, slamming his fist onto his table. "You ambushed us. You sat on this information." "I utilized the law, Mr. Fields," Thomas said coolly. "You should try it sometime." Judge Caldwell reviewed the LabCorp documents, nodding slowly. "These results appear perfectly in order and are admissible. Mr. Fields, the August 14th, will's attempt to disinherit the child based on paternity doubts is completely invalid." Vanessa was hyperventilating now. The scarlet suit that had looked so powerful 20 minutes ago now looked like a target. "Fine," she spat, her voice cracking. "Fine. Keep the stupid trust. Keep the company. But the will still stands for his personal estate. The penthouse is mine. The cars are mine. The cash is mine. He left me everything that wasn't in that trust." Thomas sighed, a long, weary sound that carried a startling amount of pity. He looked at Vanessa, shaking his head slowly. "Miss Kensington, you are absolutely correct," Thomas said softly. "The August 14th will is legally binding regarding Richard's personal residuary estate. All assets and liabilities not shielded by the Dynasty Trust belong to you." Vanessa jotted her chin out, trying to reclaim a fraction of her lost dignity. "Exactly. So I want the keys to the Trump Tower penthouse immediately." "You can have them," Thomas said. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his table. "But I suggest you also prepare yourself for the financial realities of Richard's personal estate. You see, Richard enjoyed a very, very lavish lifestyle over the past 18 months. Private jets, million-dollar jewelry, a penthouse apartment, none of which was funded by the trust, because the corporate trustee strictly cut off his access to the principal when his spending became erratic." Vanessa's face went perfectly blank. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Miss Kensington, that Richard funded his midlife crisis on credit," Thomas stated brutally. "He took out massive unsecured personal loans from Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, using his remaining 2% of liquid assets as collateral. The Trump Tower penthouse you so desperately want, it carries a $9 million mortgage with Chase Bank that is currently 2 months in arrears." Gregory Fields snatched the paper from Thomas' hand, his eyes scanning the numbers. As he read, the color completely drained from the lawyer's face. He dropped the paper as if it were on fire. "Richard Sterling's personal estate, the estate you fought so hard to claim. The estate you dragged a pregnant, grieving widow into court to secure is insolvent," Thomas announced to the dead-silent room. "It holds approximately $300,000 in liquid cash and over $14 million in toxic unsecured debt." A reporter in the second row actually gasped out loud. "Congratulations, Miss Kensington," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You are the sole beneficiary of $14 million in debt. Goldman Sachs will be seizing the penthouse by the end of the month. I hope you kept the receipts for those Louboutins." The courtroom exploded. It was a chaotic symphony of shock, laughter, and furiously scribbling pens. The mighty Mistress, who had paraded into the room dripping in stolen diamonds and arrogance, had just fought tooth and nail to inherit her own financial ruin. Vanessa let out a guttural, inhuman scream. She lunged forward, her hands clawing the air toward Thomas, but Gregory Fields and his junior associate caught her by the waist, dragging her back. "It's a lie. It's a trick." She shrieked, tears of mascara streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "He loved me. He wouldn't do this to me." "Loch, so. "He didn't care about you, Vanessa," Clara spoke up. It was the first time she had spoken since the hearing began. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a maternal steel that silenced the people immediately around her. "You were a distraction, and when the distraction got too expensive, he left you holding the bill." Judge Caldwell hammered her gavel with furious authority. "Bailiffs, remove Miss Kensington from this courtroom immediately." 2 uniformed bailiffs moved in, grabbing Vanessa by the arms. She kicked and thrashed, screaming obscenities that echoed off the marble walls, her Louboutin heels skidding helplessly across the floor as she was physically dragged backward down the central aisle. The gallery watched in stunned fascination as the woman who had sought to humiliate a pregnant widow was hauled out like a common criminal, her scarlet suit violently rumpled, her dignity shattered beyond repair. As the heavy oak door slammed shut behind Vanessa, cutting off her hysterical sobbing, Judge Caldwell let out a long breath and looked down at Clara. The sternness in the judge's eyes had melted into genuine warmth. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Caldwell said gently, "the court recognizes the Sterling Dynasty Trust as the paramount governing document. The August 14th will is relegated solely to the insolvent personal estate. You and your child are safe. This hearing is adjourned." Clara closed her eyes, tears of profound gratitude slipping down her cheek. She leaned against Thomas, who patted her shoulder with grandfatherly affection. The storm was over. The fortress had held. Against all odds, the truth had silenced the courtroom, and the rightful heir had won. The frigid October wind whipped across Staley Plaza, biting through the thin scarlet fabric of Vanessa Kensington's designer suit. Just an hour ago, she had walked through the towering glass doors of the courthouse as a conquering queen. Now she was shoved unceremoniously onto the concrete pavement by 2 stone-faced bailiffs, the heavy courthouse doors clicking shut behind her with an agonizing finality. Her meticulously pinned hair was falling in chaotic strands around her face, and her mascara had drawn thick, dark rivers down her cheeks. A small flock of ruthless tabloid photographers, having caught wind of the spectacular meltdown happening in room 204, were already circling like vultures. Flashbulbs exploded in Vanessa's face, blinding her as reporters shouted overlapping questions about forged documents and $14 million in toxic debt. "Get away from me," Vanessa shrieked, swatting blindly at a camera lens. She stumbled backward, her Louboutin heel catching on a crack in the pavement, nearly sending her sprawling. The heavy glass doors opened again, and Gregory Fields strode out, his junior associate trailing anxiously behind him. Gregory looked furious, his face set in a rigid crimson scowl as he aggressively adjusted his tie. Vanessa lunged toward him, grabbing the lapel of his expensive wool overcoat. "Gregory, you have to fix this. File an appeal. Sue the bank. Tell them the trust is a sham." Gregory roughly grabbed Vanessa's wrists, peeling her hands off his coat with undisguised disgust. He didn't look at her with the deference of an employee. He looked at her like a dangerous liability. "Fix this," Gregory hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid the microphones thrust in their direction. "Are you out of your mind? You lied to me, Vanessa. You told me Richard's entire fortune was wrapped up in that will. You completely omitted the fact that he hadn't actually owned his own real estate empire for 3.5 years." "I didn't know," Vanessa sobbed, her voice cracking in sheer desperation. "He promised me everything. He said he was going to take care of me." "Well, he didn't. He used you, and he left you holding a ticking financial time bomb," Gregory snapped, taking a step back. "I took this case on contingency, Vanessa, meaning my firm gets a percentage of the estate's positive value. There is no positive value. The personal estate is fundamentally insolvent. You have 0 assets, and I have 0 patience for clients who dragged my reputation through the mud." Vanessa's eyes widened in horror. "You can't leave me. You're my lawyer." "Not anymore," Gregory said coldly. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of invoices, and shoved them against Vanessa's chest. She reflexively grabbed them. "This is my bill for services rendered up to this minute. $350 an hour plus filing fees. As the sole named executor of the personal estate, you are liable. I expect payment by the end of the month, or I will see you in civil court." Without another word, Gregory turned and marched toward a waiting black town car, leaving Vanessa entirely alone on the sprawling concrete plaza, surrounded by laughing photographers. Meanwhile, 3 floors up, Clara Sterling was experiencing a profound, quiet peace she hadn't felt in months. She sat in a private, mahogany-paneled conference room reserved for the judge's chambers. Thomas Abernathy sat across from her, carefully organizing the towering stack of LabCorp results and trust documents back into his worn leather briefcase. Clara placed a trembling hand over her stomach, feeling a gentle, fluttering movement within. She looked out the window at the gray Chicago skyline, the crushing weight of impending homelessness completely eradicated. "I can't believe it's over," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I thought she was going to take the house, Thomas. I was terrified I'd have to bring my baby home to a rented apartment." Thomas paused, looking up at her with a gentle, grandfatherly smile. "Richard made many terrible mistakes in his final year, Clara. His arrogance blinded him, and his infidelity was unforgivable. But the one smart thing he did was establish that dynasty trust when his mind was clear and his priorities were right. He built a fortress around you and his future child, and even he couldn't tear it down when he lost his way. What happens to her now? But the pans to her?" Clara asked, unable to completely extinguish the empathy in her heart, even for the woman who had tried to destroy her. "Vanessa?" Thomas sighed, clicking his briefcase shut. "She is about to receive a crash course in high finance corporate debt. When Richard died, his personal accounts were frozen. The mortgages on the penthouse, the leases on his luxury cars, they all trigger immediate default clauses upon the debtor's passing. Goldman Sachs and Chase Bank are ruthless. By tomorrow morning, the locks on the Trump Tower penthouse will be changed by a bank-appointed receiver. Clara shook her head in quiet disbelief. She thought she was inheriting a kingdom. She inherited a crater, Thomas corrected softly. Come, Clara. I have a car waiting in the underground garage. It's time to take you home. You have a nursery to finish setting up. That evening, as Clara unlocked the heavy oak doors of her Gold Coast mansion, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old wood, Vanessa Kensington was experiencing a vastly different reality. Standing in the opulent marble hallway of Trump Tower, Vanessa furiously jammed her gold-plated key into the lock of penthouse 4B. It wouldn't turn. She tried again, panic rising in her chest, rattling the heavy handle. "Mum, please step away from the door," a stern voice echoed down the hall. Vanessa whipped around to see two building security guards flanked by a man in a cheap gray suit holding a clipboard. "I live here," Vanessa yelled, her voice echoing shrilly. "My key isn't working. Open this door immediately." "That talent." "I'm afraid we cannot do that, Miss Kensington," the man in the gray suit said, stepping forward. "I am a representative of Chase Bank. As of 4 p.m. today, this property has been formally seized due to massive mortgage default. The contents inside have been inventoried to offset the outstanding debt of the late Mr. Bart Sterling." Vanessa felt the blood drain from her face. "My clothes are in there, my jewelry, my bags. Any items purchased with funds from the insolvent estate are now collateral," the bank representative stated in a flat, uncaring monotone. "You are permitted one small duffel bag of personal toiletries, which security will fetch for you. Then you will be escorted off the premises." "Adman." Vanessa collapsed against the heavy mahogany door, sliding down until she hit the marble floor. The cold reality of her situation finally set in. She had no money. She had no lawyer. She had no home. The empire she had schemed and crawled to steal had been a mirage, and she was left holding nothing but the ashes. 3 days passed. The scandal had dominated the Chicago social scene, with local newspapers gleefully printing details of the $14 million Mistress. Clara Sterling spent those days resting, surrounded by her protective parents and the comforting walls of her secure home. Vanessa Kensington, however, was surviving on sheer frantic desperation. She had retreated to a dingy 2-star motel near O'Hare Airport, her remaining designer outfits shoved into cheap plastic garbage bags. Her credit cards, entirely dependent on Richard's frozen personal accounts, had been aggressively declined. But Vanessa was nothing if not a survivor. As she sat on the lumpy motel bed, frantically scrolling through her phone's digital files for anything she could pawn, she found it. A PDF document buried deep in her inbox, forwarded to her by Richard 6 months ago during the height of their affair. It was a confirmation letter from Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. Vanessa's breath hitched. She clicked the document, her eyes scanning the bold text. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy on Richard Harrison Sterling. The death benefit was staggering, $20 million. And right there, listed as the primary unalterable beneficiary, was Vanessa Kensington. A manic, hysterical laugh bubbled up from her throat. She hadn't lost. The trust might have the real estate, and the bank might have the penthouse, but life insurance bypassed probate court entirely. It wasn't subject to the will. It was cold, hard, untouchable cash, and it had her name on it. "I won," she whispered to the empty, mildew-scented room. "I'm going to ruin them." The very next morning, Vanessa marched into the polished, glass-walled lobby of Abernathy & Associates. She looked disheveled, her roots were showing, and her previously flawless scarlet suit was hopelessly wrinkled, but her eyes burned with vindictive triumph. She bypassed the receptionist entirely, storming down the hallway and throwing open the double doors to Thomas Abernathy's corner office. Inside, Thomas was sitting at his large mahogany desk reviewing paperwork. Across from him sat Clara, looking healthy and radiant in a soft cashmere sweater, signing a stack of trust addendums. Both looked up in surprise as the door slammed against the wall. "Miss Kensington," Thomas said, not missing a beat, though his eyes narrowed dangerously. "This is a private office. I suggest you leave before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." "Call them," Vanessa sneered, slamming a printed copy of the Northwestern Mutual policy onto Thomas's desk. She pointed a trembling finger right in Clara's face. "You thought you broke me, didn't you? You thought you left me with nothing but debt." Clara flinched slightly but held her ground, looking at the hysterical woman with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. Thomas slowly picked up the paper, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at it for a brief moment, then set it back down, letting out a long, heavy sigh. "Well?" Vanessa demanded, planting her hands on the desk. $20 million, Thomas. Richard named me the sole beneficiary. The insurance company legally has to pay me. I'm richer than this pathetic widow will ever be. I can buy and sell you both." Thomas removed his glasses, pulling a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket to clean the lenses. He didn't look intimidated. He looked deeply, profoundly disappointed. "Vanessa," Thomas began, his voice dangerously calm, "have you actually spoken to the payout underwriters at Northwestern Mutual yet? Or did you just print this off and rush over here to gloat?" Vanessa's triumphant sneer faltered. "I spoke to the automated system. It confirmed the policy is active." "Oh, it is certainly active," Thomas nodded, placing his glasses back on his face. "It is a fully funded $20 million policy. And you are indeed the named beneficiary. But you clearly do not understand how billionaire debt structuring works." Thomas opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the desk to sit perfectly parallel to Vanessa's insurance printout. "When Richard took out $14 million in unsecured personal loans to fund his lavish lifestyle with you," Thomas explained smoothly, "the banks were not stupid. They knew he was 58 years old, overweight and living recklessly. They required a guarantee. They required what is known in the financial world as a collateral assignment of life insurance. Vanessa stared at the new folder, her heart suddenly pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. "What does that mean?" "It means," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a surgical absolute zero, "that Richard legally pledged the payout of that exact Northwestern Mutual policy to his creditors. By law, upon his death, the insurance company does not pay the beneficiary. They pay the assignees first." Clara watched quietly as all the color vanished from Vanessa's face. "The insurance company will disburse $14 million directly to Chase Bank and Goldman Sachs to clear Richard's toxic debt," Thomas continued relentlessly. "The debt that, as the executor of his personal estate, you currently owe. But that leaves $6 million. Vanessa stammered desperately, clinging to the math. 20 minus 14 is 6. "I still get $6 million. "You would," Thomas agreed pleasantly, "if it weren't for the IRS. Vanessa physically stumbled back, her knees hitting one of the leather guest chairs. "Because Richard liquidated assets so aggressively, and because the personal estate is currently in catastrophic failure, there are approximately $7 million in deferred capital gains and estate penalties owed to the federal government," Thomas stated, delivering the final fatal blow. "The IRS has already placed a federal tax lien on the remainder of the insurance payout. They will seize every single penny of that remaining $6 million. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was hyperventilating, her hands shaking violently. "You get nothing, Vanessa," Thomas concluded softly, leaning forward over his desk. "The $20 million would bypass you completely, vaporized by the debt which had accumulated trying to impress you. The money is gone, the estate is bankrupt, and this time you really have played your absolute last card." Vanessa looked from the damning legal documents on the desk to Clara. For the first time since this nightmare began, Clara saw no arrogance in the mistress's eyes. There was only the hollow, devastating realization of total ruin. Without a word, Vanessa Kensington turned. She didn't stomp. She didn't yell. She practically floated out of the office, a ghost of a woman completely broken by the sheer weight of her own greed. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the office was deafening. Clara let out a long breath. She felt like she had been holding for days. She looked at Thomas, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "Is it really over this time?" Clara asked softly. Thomas smiled back, picking up his pen to resume their work. "It is, Clara. The fortress is secure. Now let's make sure everything is perfectly in order for your little one." 6 months later, the bitter, biting winds of the Chicago winter had surrendered to a bright and remarkably warm spring. Inside the sprawling Gold Coast estate, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the halls following Richard Sterling's death was entirely gone. In its place was the soft, comforting hum of new life. The tall French doors of the nursery were thrown wide open, allowing the gentle May breeze to carry the scent of blooming hydrangeas off Lake Michigan. Clara Sterling sat in a plush, velvet rocking chair, humming a quiet lullaby. Cradled against her chest was her 2-month-old son, Henry Thomas Sterling. He was a beautiful, healthy baby boy, utterly oblivious to the billion-dollar legal war that had been waged over his very existence before he had even taken his first breath. A gentle knock at the nursery door broke the peaceful silence. Clara looked up, a warm smile spreading across her face as Thomas Abernathy stepped into the room. The seasoned probate attorney looked less like a legal shark today and more like a proud grandfather, carrying a small, beautifully wrapped gift box from Tiffany & Co. I hope I'm not interrupting nap time," Thomas whispered, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he walked over to admire the sleeping infant. "Not at all, Thomas. He just went down," Clara replied softly, accepting the silver-wrapped box. "You didn't have to bring a gift. You've already given us the greatest gift imaginable. You saved our home. You saved his future." "Nonsense," Thomas said, taking a seat on the small sofa across from the rocking chair. "I merely enforced the law. You are the one who showed extraordinary grace under fire. But I am actually here on official, albeit very pleasant, business. The final probate closures were filed this morning with Judge Caldwell." Clara exhaled, a profound sense of finality washing over her. "It's completely finished, then?" "Completely," Thomas confirmed, pulling a crisp single-page summary from his jacket pocket. "The Northern Trust Company has fully stabilized the portfolio. Sterling Global Properties just closed a massive commercial deal in the Fulton Market District. The principal of the Dynasty Trust has already grown by 4% this quarter. Henry's legacy is entirely secure, locked away where no one, not even himself, until he turns 25, can mismanage it." Clara looked down at her son, gently brushing a wisp of dark hair from his forehead. "And the personal estate?" Thomas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Closed out entirely in bankruptcy court. Chase Bank seized the Trump Tower penthouse and liquidated the furniture at auction. Goldman Sachs took the remaining liquid cash, and Bank of America repossessed Richard's fleet of luxury vehicles. There wasn't a single penny left over. The Hive. Wow. Clara hesitated, almost reluctant to ask, but the lingering curiosity won out. "What happened to Vanessa?" Thomas leaned back, folding his hands over his knee. The legal community in Chicago was small, and the gossip surrounding the spectacular downfall of Vanessa Kensington was legendary. Miss Kensington learned a very harsh lesson about the consequences of blinding greed, Thomas explained, his tone devoid of any sympathy. When the IRS federal tax lien vaporized the life insurance policy, she was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing legal bills she accrued fighting you. Gregory Fields successfully sued her for breach of contract and unpaid legal fees. To satisfy the judgment, the court ordered the garnishment of her wages. "Her wages?" Doug asked. "Where is she working?" "She was forced to leave the city center," Thomas said. "She couldn't afford the rent anywhere near downtown. I understand she is currently living in a cramped subleased studio apartment out in Joliet. She took a job as a junior administrative assistant at a mid-level freight logistics company out near the interstate. The image of the woman who had once paraded into a courtroom draped in stolen family diamonds and wearing a scarlet designer suit, now sitting under flickering fluorescent lights, filing shipping manifests to pay off her own ruinous legal debts, was poetic justice in its purest form. Vanessa had tried to steal a crown she hadn't earned, and the weight of it had snapped her neck. She has no access to credit. Her reputation in the corporate real estate world is entirely destroyed, and she will be paying off the IRS and her former attorneys for the next 20 years, Thomas concluded softly. She will never bother you or Henry again, Clara. That chapter is permanently closed. Clara looked out the window, watching the sunlight dance across the meticulously manicured lawns of the estate. For so long, she had felt like a victim first of her husband's cruel betrayal, and then of his mistress's vicious ambition. But as she sat in the safety of the fortress Richard had ironically built before his corruption, she realized she was a survivor. She had protected her child, she had maintained her dignity in the face of public humiliation, and she had let the truth be her sword. "Thank you, Thomas," Clara said, her voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "For everything. It was the honor of my career, Mrs. Sterling," Thomas replied, standing up to take his leave. "Enjoy your son. He has a very bright future ahead of him." As the lawyer quietly exited the nursery, Clara stood up and walked over to the large bay window. The sprawling Chicago skyline stood tall in the distance, a testament to the empire that would one day belong to the little boy in her arms. The mistress had been silenced, the courtroom had spoken, and the true legacy of the Sterling family was finally safe. What a spectacularly satisfying downfall. Vanessa Kensington strutted into that courtroom believing she was the queen of a billion-dollar empire, only to discover she had fought tooth and nail to inherit $14 million in toxic debt and complete financial ruin. It is the ultimate proof that greed and arrogance will eventually build their own trap, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always has the final word in a court of law. Clara Sterling not only protected her unborn child's future, but she walked away with her dignity, her home, and a legacy secured by the ultimate legal checkmate. If you loved this story of shocking courtroom twists, brilliant legal revenge, and a mistress getting exactly what she deserved, make sure to hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a perfect karma story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another jaw-dropping true story.